Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really pivotal, incredibly tense moment in history. Okay, let's dive into this. We're looking at the years right before the American Civil War, a time known as the antebellum period. We're going to examine how early U.S. leaders basically used a series of political band-aids to try and hold a deeply divided nation together. It's a fascinating look at what happens when you try to delay an inevitable crisis, and honestly, it holds some incredibly valuable lessons for us even today. Before we hit the timeline, just consider these words for a second. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. That's from Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. You see, early U.S. leaders desperately wanted to act as these peacemakers. They were staring down a massive, looming moral crisis over the expansion of slavery, and they just wanted to keep the peace at almost any cost. But, as we'll see, the deals they struck, they could only delay the conflict. They couldn't actually solve it. So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the illusion of peace, move on to balancing power with the Missouri Compromise, check out the popular sovereignty experiment, look at the eruption of Bleeding Kansas, and finally wrap up with morality, education, and peace. Keep this structure in mind because it's going to really help you answer your homework questions today. All right, Section 1, the illusion of peace. You know, avoiding a serious disagreement doesn't actually make it go away. Usually, it just makes it grow. Let's move to and see how this builds. We've got three major dates creating our mental roadmap today. First up, 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Fast forward 30 years to 1850, the Compromise of 1850. And then right after that, 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each of these carefully crafted agreements bought the nation a little more time, sure, but they totally failed to address the root issue of whether slavery should be allowed to expand. And because they sidestepped the real issue, trust between the two sides just steadily eroded. Moving right along to Section 2, Balancing Power, Missouri Compromise. Now, taking a look at 1820, this first major compromise was really all about keeping a very fragile mathematical balance in the government. And that brings us directly to your second homework question. Why was balance in Congress so important? Well, at this point in time, there was an equal number of free states and slave states in the U.S. Keeping that exact equal number meant neither side had a voting advantage in the Senate. Back then, senators essentially viewed themselves as diplomats of rival nations. So if one side gained more states, they'd gain more power to just force their will on the other. Keeping that scale perfectly balanced was seen as literally the only way to hold the country together. And this brilliantly illustrates at the lengths they went to. Congress admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to keep the math absolutely perfect. But they also drew a literal line across the map at the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude mark to decide the fate of all future territories. The deal was simple. Slavery was prohibited north of the line and allowed south of it. It didn't solve the deeper moral conflict, but hey, it worked as a temporary fix. Which brings us to Section 3, the popular sovereignty experiment. Jumping ahead chronologically to the Compromise of 1850, California is entering the Union as a free state, and a brand new idea gets introduced to handle the rest of the territories. And right here is the answer for homework question number 1. What exactly is popular sovereignty? Simply put, it's letting the people who actually live in a territory vote to decide whether or not to allow slavery. Promoted heavily by Senator Stephen Douglas, this was viewed as a really clever way to avoid making those messy, top-down decisions from Congress. Just let the locals decide. Now, on paper, that sounded like a perfectly fair, democratic solution, didn't it? The theory was that local democracy works best. But the reality? Well, it was completely different. Because the stakes were incredibly high, popular sovereignty actually encouraged massive outside interference. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups realized they could literally just rush into these new territories and manipulate the vote. It led to rampant fraud and intimidation. All right, Section 4, the eruption of Bleeding Kansas. We have officially reached the climax of our timeline, the exact moment where those political band-aids are ripped off completely. So let's tackle homework question number 3. How did the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 change earlier compromises? Well, this act basically tore up those earlier geographic agreements, like that 3630 line from 1820. Instead of sticking to a fixed map, the 1854 Act let the settlers decide on slavery themselves using popular sovereignty. Massive change in the rules, that became the ultimate spark for open conflict. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it objectively breaks down your fourth homework question about what actually happened in Kansas. First, Kansas becomes the ultimate test case, and settlers absolutely flood in. You had pro-slavery border ruffians crossing over from Missouri and anti-slavery settlers rushing down from the north. Second, these deeply opposed groups form rival governments right next to each other. And third, violent clashes inevitably erupt. It was the absolute tragedy of Bleeding Kansas. I want to pause here for a second and let you think about homework question number 5. Looking back at everything, which compromise actually delayed the conflict the longest? Well, it's pretty clear looking at the dates that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 was the big winner there. It successfully bought 3 whole decades of peace before the entire system finally broke down. But of course, it did eventually break down. Without a peaceful framework, the total breakdown in dialogue made war inevitable. The big takeaway here: addressing issues honestly and early is always better than just delaying an inevitable explosion. Finally, Section 5, Morality, Education, and Peace. Let's connect this historical tragedy directly back to your own life and your education today. So, the crucial point is how this all ties into the HeroesMart Academy Godly Learners philosophy. This philosophy teaches that true education requires biblical morality. Think about it. The politicians of the 1850s were incredibly smart people. But being smart just isn't enough if you lack the moral framework to make choices that don't cause harm. Smart choices without moral grounding can still deeply hurt people. And that is captured perfectly right here in Romans 8:6-7. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. This verse promises the exact peace of mind that early American politicians entirely failed to achieve with their political deals. True peace actually requires a spiritual foundation. Which leaves us with this provocative question to wrap up our explainer. What difficult conversation are you avoiding today that might explode tomorrow? Whether it's a massive national crisis or just a personal relationship, delaying a solution never works out in the long run. Address things honestly, address them early, and keep your choices rooted in a strong moral foundation. Thanks for joining me today, and keep learning.